The Day of Love. If you're recently coupled, it's a day to remind you of your loving commitment, a day to honor your relationship with cheap chocolate and even cheaper champagne, a day to prop up the flower industry, and where expectations of your gift purchases are compared to your ex's, when where expensive is always preferred over heartfelt. It's the literal definition of excess. And if you're single, the day is only here to remind you of how unlovable you are. Yes, my friends, Valentine's Day is the absolute worst. But where did this ridiculous day of love come from? Patron saint of cheap chocolate? You're close. Now, part of the reason this pseudo-holiday is the worst is because of its beginnings. Frankly, it doesn't really have any. Of course, the Catholic Church would love for you to believe that it is due to the feast of St. Valentine, but even then, that story gets murky. More on that in a few. But you may have to go a bit further back to ancient Rome to get the history. We're talking around 6th century BC. You see, back then, the middle of February was a celebration of fertility called the Feast of Lupercalia. And if you know anything about ancient Rome, fertility basically translates easily into a feast of sex.
What time? Sexy time.
And no, it didn't start with a bunch of people exchanging cute cards that asked for a kiss. No, the Romans did it only the way they could. They got naked, sacrificed a couple animals to kick the party off, namely a goat and a dog. Then the naked men would skin the animals, and the women would line up to be whipped by the hides, as they believed it would help their fertility. Now, at this point, the men would all draw names of the women from a jar and then be coupled with that woman until the end of the festival. Now, it is true, some of those forced couples ended up in love and long-term relationships, and a lot of people point to that as some sort of "aww" moment. But sadly, let's just say a lot of the women ended up drawing the short straws here. The feast lasted for centuries and over the years became less and less debaucherous. And the nudity and the whipping became less and less of a thing. And even though the festival got co-opted by the Catholic Church, it is surprisingly enough still celebrated by some. And of course, we can't have any of these celebrations happening on the Pope's watch now, can we? So the church decided to throw another blanket on the pagan festival scene. That said, we can actually thank the Feast of Lupercalia for lending us the name Valentine's Day. You see, in the 3rd century, Emperor Claudius II executed 2 or 3 men, all named Valentine, on the same day, years apart. Yes, that day was February 14th. That said, records weren't all that well kept back then. Now, the first Valentine was arrested for assisting other Christians in the area and was marrying them. Now, according to the legend, Valentine was offered the chance to reject his faith or die. So, death it was. This was the Valentine that the church hooked their wagon to. As of the 5th late century AD, the Catholics were gaining steam, and that's when Pope Gelasius,
Pope Gelasius I,
decided to eliminate Lupercalia, and he replaced it with a day to celebrate the martyrdom of St. Valentine. Now, this ended up being risky business at the time, though, as you couldn't have all them God-fearing Christians actually enjoying their life.
What time? Sexy time.
And even today, some biblical scholars warn Christians not to celebrate Valentine's Day because of the pagan history involved. No one tell them about the other holidays, okay?
But I have to lay my eggs.
Now, the holiday quickly separated itself from the church over the years and became romanticized by poets and authors. Shakespeare even mentioned it once, though his plays never really had happy endings.
Dateless bargain.
But the big one to push the day of love was Geoffrey Chaucer. In fact, he is credited as being the first to connect romantic love with February 14th, as his poem Parliament of Fowls is considered the first ever Valentine's poem. And at the time it was rather spicy too, as it hinted at a more modern concept of love where the woman actually had the power in her own romantic decisions. What an idea. As the years marched on, the concept of a day devoted to love caught on in Britain and the rest of Europe and gave birth to the first Valentine's cards. At the time, these cards were handmade and often professed love to another in an attempt to gain that person's interest. And this continued for a few centuries, that is, before capitalism decided to destroy the very fabric of the day. You see, as the Industrial Revolution boomed, so did the printing press, and with that, the handmade card went by the wayside. And of course, it was revolutionized by an American card company. As of 1913, Valentine's cards were rolling off the presses of the Hall brothers. Now, this company started in 1907 as the Norfolk Postcard Company and was devoted to the craze of postcards. By 1912, the company had moved to Kansas and was selling Christmas letters, and then they shortened their name to the Norfolk Card Company. By 1917, they had invented wrapping paper. By 1922, they expanded across the country. And by 1928, they introduced the brand name of Hallmark, which was named after the symbol used by goldsmiths in the 14th century. By 1954, they took that brand name and made it their own. Hallmark. As for the connection with chocolates, well, you can thank British chocolatier Richard Cadbury. Yes, that Cadbury. In 1861, he had a massive idea for a sale. A heart-shaped box that was packed full of chocolate. And the idea was simple. You'd buy it for the chocolate and save the box for the sweet love letters. This was a marketing juggernaut, and the company made several different variations, all covered in silk, satin, and lace, and challenged men to find just the right box for just the right woman. By the 1930s, the craze reached the US, and Russell Stover introduced the secret lace heart, which is still referred to as the lingerie box. And at that point, it was cemented. And between the chocolate and the cards, the commercialization of this nothing holiday was well underway. Okay, so what about the chubby baby archer? For that, we have to go back to some of the darker stuff. So Cupid comes from Greek mythology and used to go by the name of Eros, which is the Greek word for desire. He was the son of Aphrodite, and he would literally play with the hearts of mortals and gods, making people fall in love by his will. He was a young man in his late teens and was both handsome and rather threatening. And he was also considered rather untouchable, and in the words of Greek literary sources, unconquerable. And if you haven't figured it out yet, at the time he was more feared than he was celebrated, with several different texts calling him sinister. Then the Romans co-opted him and turned him into a baby figure that only followed the will of his mother, Venus. That's the Roman version of Aphrodite. And his name was changed to Cupid, a name that was synonymous with Eros and meant desire. And this was for a few reasons. The idea of this grown man walking around and befalling love on unsuspecting people was, in a word, creepy. But a baby? I mean, come on. It's just adorable. And as the Feast of Lupercalia was in full swing, this cherub brought a bit of sweetness to what was a bit of a chaotic event, especially if you were a woman. Over the centuries, artists really picked up and ran with the adorable concept, and especially Renaissance painters who just loved to depict him as a chubby kid. And then, in 1602, the world got the Caravaggio's Cupid, and the image was complete. A kid with a penchant for archery and donning those now famous wings. Now, for the red rose, we find ourselves back in Greek mythology. Now, the red rose itself was tied to Aphrodite as it grew in her garden from her tears and the blood of her lover Adonis. It is there that we get the original ties between the color red and passion. Of course, with the commercialization of Valentine's Day, we also decided to introduce multiple colors that had different meanings. That way, the flower industry could inflate even more over the coming years. Okay, let's do some bonus facts. The growing pressure for Valentine's Day has spawned a few other days to try to counter it. The first is SAD, or Singles Awareness Day, which is held the day after Valentine's on February 15th. Now, there is no exact info on when it started, but in 2001, a high school student named Dustin Barnes formed a group of his friends to celebrate their singleness. It is also a protest day, allowing those that wanted to give the ultimate middle finger to consumerism by buying heavily discounted chocolate. Now, the 15th became more and more popular among young people, and by 2015 was actually being celebrated around the world. Next up, though, March 14th is, the steak and that day. Now, this is an unofficial and frankly rather satirical holiday that came about the same time as Sad Day. Again, no concrete proof of when it was started, but a lot of people believe it kicked off as a stunt on a radio station. DJ Tom Birdsley on WFNX in Boston apparently called the day in 2002. Now, this caught on quickly because, men. And while it pops up on social media each year as a meme, it's still rather controversial. You see, there are a few issues with this day. First off, March 14th is also Pie Day. And you don't mess with pie.
Well, we'll just tell your mother that we ate it all.
Also, the fact that the naming convention of the day was rather rude to some, it really isn't being adopted across the board. I mean, there's nothing like having your mom see that on your Facebook post, right? Now, there's also ties to the men's movement, which has stalled success for the day as well, considering it was sexist and pandering to men. And with that, I'm pretty sure it won't become much of a thing in the future. By the way, it also spawned the women's equivalent day for April 14th, again another day I can't say on here. And finally, Just how big has Valentine's Day become, you ask? Well, in the US, in 2022 alone, people spent $23.9 billion on Valentine's Day. That is according to the National Retail Federation. By the way, $2.3 billion of that went to just flowers, which averages out to $17 per person. And what is worse, they think that number will grow this year. And even weirder still, in 2020, people spent $1.7 billion on Valentine's Day gifts for their pets. A number that did drop in 2021, but experts peg that on the pandemic and love not being in the air, only COVID. And in case you were worried about Hallmark fading into obscurity, fret not. According to some reports, 144 million people send Hallmark cards on Valentine's Day. Either way, whether you celebrate it or not, I hope your February 14th brings you everything you want.
What time? Sexy time.
Thanks for watching.